So this is 1 John chapter 2, the scripture for the 3rd of July. I think few other chapters of scripture are so skillful at weaving condemnation and hope as 1 John 2 is. There's no gray area, either in the naming of sin or in the naming of God's love. John is all in on both. Both are done very, very directly. Now, there is one thing that comes up at the very beginning of 1 John 2, though, and that's verse 2. So in verse 2, John claims that Jesus is the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. And I want to sit with this for a minute because I think it's funny. There are times when I get accused of not taking the Bible seriously enough because I don't interpret, say, Genesis 1 and 2 as literally as some folks do. While God could have, of course, created the earth in 6 literal days, I think that science suggests to us that God may have chosen to do it in a different way, and that Genesis 1 and 2 offer us a thematic way of understanding the creation of the world and offer us a glimpse behind the curtain to see that no, God actually did have design in mind when he created the world. Similarly, with the idea of the worldwide flood in Genesis chapters 6, 7, and 8, I believe, that may not have actually been a worldwide flood. It may have been a local flood that took out civilization as we knew it. Regardless of how you interpret that, though, and regardless of how seriously folks who don't take Scripture literally take Scripture, there are sometimes when the literalists will accuse us of not taking Scripture seriously just because we don't take it literally. We see this also in some of Paul's letters, where in 1 Timothy chapter 2, he talks about not allowing women to teach or have authority in the church. We'll talk more about that once we get there in our reading plan this year, but there's some context to that you can't just take the literal words at face value. What I find interesting about all this, though, and this is straying a bit far afield from 1 John, we're coming back now. What I find interesting about all this is that those same folks who insist on a literal reading, a plain sense reading of Scripture in these other places, when they look at 1 John 2 and see, well, Jesus is the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the whole world, they'll say, well, that couldn't be the case. And they'll dismiss the plain sense reading here. Somehow they discern different shades of meaning in 1 John 2:2, and I think the moral of the story is that a consistently literal reading of Scripture isn't necessarily the best way to read Scripture, and you can have a deep sense of Scripture's authority and inspiration even without a literal reading. Jesus he forgives the sins, not necessarily of everyone in the whole world, but Jesus atones for the sins of all peoples in the world, whether they're Jews or Gentiles. That's what is being driven at here in 1 John 2:2. So, John names 3 groups in this chapter that are affected by the light that Jesus shines on the world. The first is little children, and then young adults, and then elders. Each of these groups is necessary for a thriving community of faith. Elders, the word that's rendered fathers in the NRSV, they're the ones who call us over and over again to remember the main thing, that God has been around and at work since before we came on the scene. And that's an integral thing for the church to remind us of. Young adults have the mixture of knowledge and passion to effect true and lasting change in the world. And John is very keen on them actually doing it. John is not just humoring them, he's giving them real authority in the church to make change. Children can grow without fear of being unloved, and from the safety of God's love can know the Father and then can strike out on their own. That's the environment we're called to give to children. In 1 John 2, we also see the very first use of the word Antichrist in all of the New Testament. In fact, the word Antichrist is only used 5 times in the New Testament, 4 times in 1 John, and then 1 time in 2 John. It's tied to deception and to the denial of Jesus as the Christ. Antichrist, in other words, is anyone who elevates other objects of worship for the Christian community, other objects besides Jesus. Having Antichrist in the midst of the church can be incredibly toxic and unhealthy. If your identity, for example, is tied to a cause or a political party or an ideology that's not Jesus Christ, It's possible that you are playing the role of Antichrist. Fortunately, God forgives sin. And even when we were still sinners, when we were God's enemies, Christ came to die for us. And that's the good news of the gospel. So make Jesus the most important person in your faith and life, and then watch as he restructures your priorities for the better, as he shines a light on your life. I wonder, how can you welcome children, young adults, and elders into your community of faith? That's all for 1 John chapter 2. On Monday, the 6th, we'll be looking at 1 John chapter 3. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.